and welcome to episode 32 of Sarastro's Marvel Crisis Protocol painting series. In this video I'll be painting Vulture from the Marvel Crisis Protocol miniatures game by Atomic Mass Games. My approach to painting this majestic figure will involve using the airbrush to help achieve some smooth gradients for the wings, although you could achieve a similar look with a brush and a little more time, followed by some dark lining and a few glinting highlights. I'll then be painting the face, where I'll be aiming for a nicely aged look, followed by the suit, where I want to achieve a clear contrast with the wings through some subtle changes to both the colour palette and texture, and we'll finish the model off by painting the base. Let's begin. You can see that I've primed the figure in black, followed with some zenithal highlights as usual, and I've also added some additional debris to the base. I'm going to begin by painting the wings using some Vallejo Model Air colours that I happened to have on the shelf. I want quite a bluish green for the shadows, so I'm using a mix of dark green and steel blue, and I decided to aim for a less saturated look in the highlights, where I've chosen to use duck egg green. Even with the Model Air colours, I like to add a little airbrush thinner and flow improver to help prevent blockages. Here I'm adding the blue until I'm happy with the look, and I ended up with a ratio of about 3:1 of the green to blue. I'm now using this to colour the wings with a couple of even passes. Next I'm adding increasing amounts of the duck egg green and applying the paint from a largely zenithal direction to create the highlights. As usual when airbrushing, we want to build the values up in gradual thin layers. This is now pure duck egg green. I then decided to bring back some saturation with a reapplication of the base tone, aimed up into the main areas of shadow. And here I'm returning to the duck egg green to give a final boost to the values at the upper end. Next I want to darken down the recesses, and I've chosen to thin some oil paints to do this, but you could of course use regular acrylics if you like. So here I'm creating an off-black tone by mixing in some dark green and blue. I'm certainly no expert with oil paints, so I'm just feeling my way. When thinned, the paint certainly flows nicely into the recesses, and if any paint gets onto the flat areas, we can clean things up with the thinner. Because the paint takes so long to dry, we have plenty of time to tidy things up if needed. After speeding up the drying time with a hairdryer, I'm now going in with a more opaque consistency to help further darken some of these lines. Next I'm going to finish the wings off with some glinting highlights using some pale green off-white. Here I just want to catch some of these upturned edges as well as the various sharp corners. and I'm using pure white for the brightest glints. Next I'm going to paint the face, and as usual I'm starting with the eyes, where I'm using an off-white, followed with some black for the pupils and surrounding area. After a bit of back and forth, I managed to position the pupils towards the top of each eye, which I think works quite well for this sculpt. For the skin, I'm using pink flesh darkened with burnt sienna umber, and on a whim I decided to add a little sap green to create a slightly less healthy hue. Before highlighting the face, I'm going to provide a base colour for the surrounding neck piece. For that, I'm using a warm grey mix of rainy grey and a little black, and I'll be adding some Nacar for the highlights. So this is the base or shadow tone, and I'll be creating some initial volume by adding some Nacar for the upper, more highlighted area. I'm loosely blending these tones on the model, and we'll be adding some further highlights later on. I'm now going to highlight the skin by adding some additional pink flesh along with some golden flesh to the base tone, and then some vanilla white for the brighter highlights. You can see that I'm doing a bit of stippling to give the skin a more textured, mottled look. Along the way, I'm freely playing with some additional touches of green. Here I've added some moss green, for example, which I'm using to tint the sides of the face and head. And I'm also mixing a little green into the highlight tones too. I went back and forth a little with some more pinkish tones for the mouth. And I'm pushing this coloured cast on the chin area with some glazes of Sap Green mixed with Prussian Blue. Here I'm glazing a little red around the nose and eye area. Elsewhere, I'm freely pushing the green tint. I'm now articulating the eyebrows with a mid-grey tone. Here I'm adding some age spots, which I'm then glazing over with the skin tone. and these are my last couple of highlights. I'm now returning to add some highlights to the neck piece, working up to pure Nacar. And here I decided to add some white sands for the brightest highlights. Moving on to the rest of the suit, I'd like to create a clear contrast with the treatment of the wings. So I'm going to use a dark base tone mix of Boreal Tree Green and a little black, before highlighting up to pure Boreal Tree Green, and then with the addition of a mix of Irati Green and Spring Green for the brighter highlights. So here I'm darkening the Boreal Tree Green with some black. We can block in some initial areas of highlight with the Boreal Tree Green to speed things along a bit. And then establishing a broad mid-tone highlight of Boreal Tree Green. I'm now mixing some Irati Green and Spring Green to create the highlight tone. I'm then adding this to the Boreal Tree Green to begin building up the highlights. Building up quite a wide range of values like this will take some time, but I decided to allow for a little roughness in the texture, which lets me work a little more quickly, and also provides another point of contrast with the smooth finish of the wings. Notice I'm often using little lines and stipples to apply these highlights. I'm using the pure Irati Green and Spring Green mix for the brightest highlights. Finally, I'm painting the base, using some mid-grey tones as usual, followed with some dark lining for the cracks. For the bricks, I felt that a purplish gradient would work nicely, so here I'm loosely using Petroleum Gray and African Shadow, along with some pink flesh for the lighter values. For the viewer, I'm providing a base colour of Gobi Brown mixed with a little black. And I'm now dry brushing the ground with some birch to bring out the surface texture and create a bit of a pale vignette. I'm now pushing the highlights on the brickwork by mixing in some birch. I'm also using birch to paint the mortar between the bricks, followed with some tidying up if needed. For the viewer, I'm saving time by overbrushing or dry brushing most of the highlights on, firstly using pure Gobi Brown. I'm then mixing in some Sahara Yellow, then Tenere Yellow for the brighter highlights. I'm now adding some white sands and adding a few small glinting highlights to finish things off. Next, I've chosen to add some newspapers to the ground, carefully chosen to include some touches of green to help unify the whole model. And I've also decided to brush some thinned green into the shadow and midtones of the viewer. With the base complete, I'm now finishing the model off with a few final highlights for the suit. And this completes Vulture. Thank you for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the episode. As usual, you can find full paint and product lists in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found online, including Patreon, Instagram, Facebook, and Spotify if you enjoy the music. As always, my sincerest thanks go to my amazing patrons for funding this work. If you'd like to help support what I do, feel free to hit the Patreon link and pledge what you can. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Marvel Crisis Protocol. Happy painting!